In the Visuddhimagga, which is the classic text on vipassana practice used in many of the Southeast Asian countries, the path, the stages to enlightenment are enumerated as 7, referred to as the Satta Visuddhaya, or 7 purifications. Now, this is only one of many, many possible formulations of the path, and I think, it's useful to study these things, but it's also extremely dangerous to study these things, because then we get an idea that, well, it has to conform exactly to what's in this book or in that book. And then we get caught in studying the maps and not making the journey, or worse still, spending our time arguing with people about what the right map is. However, having said that, there's also things we can learn that can give us a heads up, that can be useful. Rather close to stream entry, which is where it culminates in enlightenment, initial enlightenment. One of the stages rather close to that is called an awareness of Udayabhaya. That means rising, passing. That is followed by an awareness not of it rises, then it passes, but rather an awareness it is passing as it is arising. It's very clearly stated. That's a stage different from awareness of rising and passing, and one of greater sensitivity or awareness. There are things that people are typically aware of and things that people are typically not aware of. People are typically drawn to the moment of arising and typically miss the moment of passing. And it's a very deep training to learn how to detect the moment of passing. As you develop a sensitivity to that, you get to this experience that Buddhaghosa, the author of the Visuddhimagga, was referring to, whereby as soon as any event is arising, you detect within it its passing. To paraphrase T.S. Eliot, in my beginning is my end. It's like no sooner has it begun, but it's palpably ending, not theoretically. In fact, the ending is absolutely as salient. That the passing, as it's arising, is as salient as the arising. Now, that seems to have something to do with the timing of sensory processing in the brain. And quite what it has to do with that, I'm not sure. But that would, to me, I would conjecture that since there's nothing really mystical, schmystical about that notion, that might be a good place to begin an investigation, a scientific investigation of enlightenment, since awareness of passing as soon as it's arising is so near to enlightenment in that formulation. What's interesting is that the temporal metaphor of it's passing as soon as it's rising leads to a spatial metaphor. Because remember, every sensory experience, as I like to look at sensory experience, every sensory experience has spatial volume. It has width, depth, and height. Perhaps not well defined, but even mental events, you have images, they occupy space. You have talk, it's sort of in your head. And if you If you can listen on the right, you can listen on the left, you can zoom out and see how far the talk goes and discover that, hey, it's like bigger than your head, okay? It has spatial qualities. So that means when something is arising, its space is growing. Now, if something is also passing as it's arising, then its space is collapsing at the same time. And I know it's pretty subtle, but it's detectable. And that gives you a perception of what Sasaki Roshi calls father and mother pulling apart and giving birth to the present. So temporarily, if we take the model of the Visuddhimagga, I give you the heads up, there may come a time in your practice where as soon as things are arising, they're passing, and that's not a concept, it's salient. Heads up, that's a temporal metaphor, that's a temporal perception, but since all experience is spatial, that means as soon as space is being born, it's also collapsing. So it's spreading out and pulling in at exactly the same time. And that would be true with regards to any sensory experience. So specifically, feel, image, talk, individually, and then collectively, all three at once, born in between this flow of space. Then, you remember the koan that Sasaki Roshi frequently gives when you see the flower, how do you experience your true self? So let's say that you've been habitually paying attention to how feel, image, talk arise subtly, all three at once, and they arise in this expanding, contracting force field. So that's now becomes, you've got a momentum of that. That's sort of second nature. So when you look at an object that's external sight, well, guess what? It does exactly the same thing. Each little shift in the external visual is an arising and a passing. That means a spreading and a collapsing. That means since each little part is that way, the whole experience is that way. Then your three fountains, and I don't mean linear fountains that go up and down, gushing and gathering, I mean in all six directions, okay? It's like fountains that gush and gather in all the directions of space. That's, the self is arising in that as feel, image, talk, and each thing you look at has exactly the same flow of space. And those two waves, the simultaneous expansion and contraction in fit, and the simultaneous expansion and contraction in it meaning any touch, sight, or sound, they cannot be held apart. They simply cannot be held apart. They automatically become a single expansion and contraction. And there is an absolute union. And the separation between subject and object, inside and outside, are annihilated for a moment. And there is only the activity of the source. That activity, so one theme, temporally passing as soon as it's arising. Spatially, collapsing as soon as it's spreading. Exact same thing. Now, one other theme. There is a kind of absolute spontaneous effortlessness to the way space spreads and collapses. So at the very at the very arising, as soon as an experience occurs, begins to occur, there's a kind of effortless, refreshing spontaneity, a kind of just happeningness to it. These themes of spatiality and spontaneity are hugely emphasized in the Dzogchen tradition of Tibetan practice. They're linked. So that there is a kind of refreshing, dynamic taste of effortlessness that is present inside the spaciousness. Problem with the word spacious, though, is it implies, oh, there's this giant space that's always there. That's why it's spacious. No, spaciousness means has the nature, the elastic nature of space, to be able to spread and collapse at the same time. So the spreading and collapsing it's sort of effortless, and you can get a sense that you're just riding on it. In Zen, they call that riding the ox backwards, because you don't know where you're going, but you don't have to know where you're going. You're mounted on the ox of the source. This could be described as literally praying continuously. With each sensory event, there is a tangible contact with the source. What determines the life of a star? What's the big picture as to how a star lives? Well, there are two forces that dominate the physics of a star. A contractive force of gravitation, which is universal. But then what happens, so that gathers hydrogen and other, I guess basically hydrogen, maybe a little helium. Let's say it gathers hydrogen. Let's say it's a primary star, so it gathers hydrogen. But what happens when you compress a gas? Well, I mean, a lot of things happen, but what's the main thing that happens that you first think of? It heats up. But what happens when things heat up? They expand. So there's thermal photon pressure that is constantly pushing out against the gravitational force that's constantly pulling in. So it's a contest between expanding space and contracting space. And the star goes in cycles, where one dominates, then the other dominates. So if a star had sensory experience and were to report on its sensory experience, it would say, I am born in between expansion and contraction. That's what it would say if it could say anything. So a star might say that. And isn't it interesting that at each expansive contractive cycle, there's a nurturing process. What gets nurtured, what gets given birth to, are the heavier and heavier atoms. How did we get from hydrogen to all the other atoms, including the silicon and the oxygen and nitrogen and carbon that we need for planets and life and so forth? Where did that come from? It was cooked inside stars, primary stars. And if the stars were big enough, at the end of their life, they experienced total simultaneous expansion and contraction. So intense that a part of the star collapses either to a neutron star or a black hole, and the other part accelerates at unbelievable velocities out into the universe and showers all the universe with those heavy atoms, which then can recoagulate in secondary stars like our sun, that can then have planets around them because of the heavier elements. There's carbon, oxygen, life can arise. So we are literally made of stardust, quite literally. The carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the atoms of life, everything but hydrogen, is born in between. How about galaxies? Well, it's now believed that galaxies are a giant cloud of stars, and in the center of them is a supermassive black hole. So there's a contractive core and an effusive cloud. How about an atom? Same deal. Incredibly massive nucleus, contractive core, effusive cloud of electrons around. So if you ask a galaxy, who gave birth to you? If it could speak, it would say, I'm born in between expansion and contraction. So would an atom. As small as an atom may seem, it's gargantuan relative to the Planck scale of length. When you get down, and then, of course, there's the ultimately large. There's the size of the observable universe. Major theme, okay? What's the holy grail of modern physics is to somehow unify the theory of gravity, which deals with the largest conceivable structure, with the theory of quantum physics, quantum field theory, and so forth, which deals with what happens when you look at very small parts. There's no theory at this point that is unified, no unified field theory. So I find it intriguing that the edge of physics is somehow related to this issue of small and large. What's the fate of the universe? Well, no one knows. But a common conjecture is that it will depend on something called the cosmological constant. And would you believe it? The cosmological constant is actually a ratio of two physical quantities. And what do you suppose? One of those quantities expands the universe. And the other, what do you think? Contracts. And no one knows what that ratio is. It seems to all involve these weird flavors of interplay of expansive and contractive things. And somehow what's born in between will be either virtual particles that come out of nothing in the quantum soup of the ultimately small, or seemingly the universe itself. Now, I may just be projecting this, based on my own experiences and points of view. In which case, fine. Then there's no great cosmic meaning to this paradigm of enlightenment that I like to share with you. But maybe it's not a coincidence. Well, let's put it this way. Whether this born in betweenness that we can experience in deep mindful states, whether that's related to these larger sort of principles of nature or not, in a sense it's irrelevant because we're doing this practice not in order to validate science or to have science validate us. We're doing this practice so that we can be happy in the deepest and broadest sense of the word. So it's pragmatic, not theoretical, why we do this practice. But if in some way it relates to deep theory, well, I think that's sort of cool also. Our source, the source of moment-by-moment experience in my nervous system, is the same flow of nature that is the source of moment-by-moment experience in everybody's nervous system. Therefore, if you on a regular basis experience life this way, you're constantly having an experience of the oneness of inside and outside. Therefore, you naturally, spontaneously, in a sense, whether you want to or not, cannot help but respond. Respond to the needs of your larger identity. So to meditate and to give to others the fruits of meditation. How do you give to others the fruits of meditation? Well, you teach them. How do you teach them? Well, you teach them at a subtle level by the unconditional positive regard that channels through your affect because you're seeing them as you. So there's just a good vibe that comes out, that people feel happy and in safety just by being in your presence. That's a subtle level of teaching. Another subtle level of teaching is people that know you and see you change for the better over the months, years, and decades. That's a very powerful sermon. You teach by answering, by describing what you do when you meditate. That's, people say, hey, we went to a meditation retreat. What did you do? You're not going to instruct them in meditation. You're not even going to necessarily encourage them to meditate. But if you can give a coherent description of the meditative endeavor, a coherent description is a cogent description. Coherent means what you say is your words are well-defined and they make sense logically and they're reasonable given evidence, okay? So you give just a coherent description of what you do. Or put alternatively, you give a non-blabbering, muddled description of what you do. You'd be amazed how easy it is to be blabber and be incoherent when people ask you what you do in meditation, right? It's like, well, it's sort of hard to explain. It's like it's intuitive. It's like it's a finger pointing to a hazy moon. Well, that may be Zen poetry, but I don't call that a coherent description. The Buddha said that the Dhamma is sanditthiko, that means crystal clear, and ehipassiko, of the nature of, try it for yourself and you'll see. Anybody can see it. So if you give just a coherent description in 30 seconds, well, we did this, we did this, we did this, that's a powerful teaching. So you should at least be able to describe in a way that the normal human being can get some sense of what you're talking about, coherently what you do. The simplest coherent description that I have found just about anyone can understand, any adult can understand, is, well, you know how in daily life, sometimes you're more focused, sometimes you're less focused. Have you noticed that? Most people will say yes. Well, did you ever notice that in the times when you're more focused, you're more effective and you feel better, and then when you're less focused, you know, less, yeah, most people, they've experienced that. And then you say something like, well, you know how if you like systematically develop a skill, you get better and better at it? Most people have developed a skill. Well, meditation's like that. We do systematic practice that develops a skill that increases our baseline of concentration in daily life, so we have more experiences naturally of being focused, and therefore we're more effective and more fulfilled. Most people can follow the logic of that. So that's a coherent description that takes 30 seconds or a minute. Then you are a teacher. You have taught at the descriptive level. Then there's teaching at the what might be described as the prescriptive level. You prescribe. In other words, you say, okay, I'm going to teach you this technique, do it this way, report back to me. In other words, you're explicitly teaching meditation. You're a meditation facilitator or a teacher. That's sort of the explicit level. So the way that, so a consequence of continuous contact with the source is that you realize you share the source with everyone you want to serve. You can serve in the ordinary sense of helping people's conditional happiness. That's good. And you could also serve in the extraordinary sense of teaching. And you can teach by your affect. You can teach by your behavior changes. You can teach by just describing how meditation works. And some of you, probably many of you, will want to move on to the explicit level of teaching at some point. And that's as good as it gets.